If your product uses AI models from the US, this Anthropic story should get your attention, and not in the way you think it might. So Anthropic just released their Mythos and Fable 5 model, their new flagship model, a couple days ago. And now they say the US government has issued them to restrict access to that model to non-US citizens, including employees of them that are not US citizens. And we don't know the full government reasoning and how this drama is going to play out. But there's a new precedent being set and a new line being drawn. And that is that it's not just about bad actors of people on a terrorist list or maybe sanctioned countries that might not get access to a new model. And as a founder building AI products in Europe, that worries me. And I think if you're building on AI products in Europe, you should also take this very seriously. You have an Anthropic API key and you use it in your application and you serve your customers with that. But if the compute, the model, and even the policies around it are all not based in your jurisdiction, you don't really have control over anything that happens here. And having no infrastructure to be model agnostic within your product or workflow just moved from like a theoretical risk to a real risk. So this is not a video about panicking or not using US models at all. It is more of a practical thinking exercise and checklist I wrote down for myself on how I think about independence, reliability, and kind of sovereignty in how we build digital products that use AI. And luckily, we already have some practical technical steps we can do to mitigate some of these risks. But let's just first quickly run through both the announcement as well as a super well-written article by Armin Ronacher, who is developing the Pi agent and I think said it better than I could. So Fable 5 is the more restricted version that already on biology and cybersecurity questions often defers to not answering or degrading you to a dumber model in order to make sure you don't get that cutting edge intelligence. Bottom line is that Fable 5 still almost crushed any benchmark that there was. And the argument just now is like how far they're ahead and when can other model providers follow suit. So now that's the new flagship model that breaks every benchmark and everybody wants to use that model. And after already delaying the release for a couple of months here for security reasons, the US government now intervened and issued basically an export control directive. Anthropic says the directive requires them to suspend access to Fable 5 and Mythos 5 for foreign nationals, whether inside or outside the US. And because they didn't have measures in place in order to verify the identity of every single user, they just had to pull it completely. So I'm not going to pretend that I know anything about what happens behind the scenes here or what the politics are involved, but it is important to understand, and we don't need to know everything to understand which line is being drawn here. According to Anthropic, nationality is now part of like the access rights. And Armin, creator of Flask, developer on Pi, his framing is like the sharpest I found. This technology is apparently so good that only Americans should use it. So we moved from like don't sell this to hostile governments to like don't give this to anybody but ourselves. At least not now, right? You might think, okay, let's stay in the lead for a year here and then we release it to everybody. And if the models are too dangerous for everyone, why is it safe for Americans to use? I think that's the checking question you can ask yourself. So this is about export controls. This is about keeping competitive advantage. This can't be about safety anymore. And as a European, I think here it becomes interesting because in the past, big tech was just mostly regulated by the EU. And the European Union can write rules and it can fine companies and it can like set market access conditions, but Europe cannot regulate the US model providers to deliver the models to Europe, right? Like that doesn't work. So if you have the models here, you can start regulating them. If they just pulled, we can't force the US companies to deliver them. And I want to just quickly highlight how this dependency of the EU here is different than the dependency on, let's say, cloud infrastructure. So Europe is already super dependent on US internet platforms, right? You have search, social, server infrastructure, mobile operating systems and developer platforms. It's been using we've been using American tech infrastructure for forever, really. But the AI wave and the AI tooling is really not the internet. So the incentives are just different. Internet platforms, all they wanted is more users. The cost of adding an incremental users is close to zero. And the network effects mean that it's more valuable to have more people online, right? Just simply speaking, you can sell more ads to more people. So it is in your business interest to just add as many people as possible because the marginal cost of adding people is very, very minimal. While with AI platforms, the issue is that every incremental user burns tokens, uses CPUs, uses energy downstream. And so actually there is a cost to adding more people. Now, obviously, businesses be businesses, right? And they obviously offer these products to almost everybody except sanctioned countries. But the incentive system is different, right? We already know that companies like Anthropic are compute constrained. So they struggle to actually deliver that much compute to everybody, meaning that it is a resource game. And so the practical question doesn't become, is Anthropic bad or are US models bad, but are you relying on resources that you might not have in the future? If you are building a product that has AI in it, right, it somehow wraps around the AI models, or you have internal workflows that you're working on automating with AI, then the practical question is just, are we depending on a sole provider somewhere? And asking the other questions of like, what happens if that provider is down? What happens if that provider doesn't offer the model anymore? What happens if the provider changes the retention rules, meaning that they retain the data? This is something Anthropic did too with the Fable release. They forced everybody to opt into retaining the data that you would use in the model, even though you had the policy set up that like, don't store any of my data, please. They said this is not possible with the newest model. And also be aware that if the model provider starts using like refusals or rerouting to a dumber model in case your question is deemed somewhat dangerous, then this might affect your customer's experience. So in your product demo, this might not make a difference, but in production it does. So while we're already building on top of non-deterministic LLMs in our products, we now add another layer of reliability issues that we need to control for. So with that dramatic background, what are the steps that we've taken and that I recommend other AI teams to take as soon as possible? The first thing is to abstract away from an individual provider or an individual model. If in your code you're calling an individual model or an individual provider, that is a dependency risk you don't want to keep. Being ready for that by adding an abstraction layer where you have something like the Vercel AI gateway or OpenRouter set up where you can be model agnostic in your code is a very, very smart first step. The goal is your application calls an interface and not OpenAI or Anthropic directly. And then the second point is substitution risk. So just because you theoretically could switch out a model now that you have this abstraction in place, the question or not is whether or not you know which model to use and if you can. So what we need to know is which model to use, and if so, how does the quality change? And so to be truly model agnostic and provider agnostic, you have to have an evaluation and testing pipeline so you can quite easily get to a point where you understand that if needed, we could replace this model with this model from another provider. And how we set this up was that we actually have in the code like a fast model and a smart model. Smart models are usually slower. And those are placeholders with one primary model and a secondary model defined. And for both the primary and the secondary, we run evaluations, evals and rubrics in order to make sure that we understand kind of what the trade-offs are and how this would perform with our system and tasks our users have to our product. And as the model landscapes evolves, you obviously have to promote like new models into that rank, right? Like we have to replace our fast model regularly and we have to replace our smart models regularly. And the next point is about data and control risk. So what do you give up? So where does your data go? How long is it stored? And kind of which model does what, which provider does what. For B2B customers, you care about sub-processors, you care about where those models are hosted, where the data is stored and for how long. And now additional challenges with these AI providers is about like are refusals happening, or how are provider side like policy changes affecting retention, like all of a sudden we keep the data for longer. Or let's say you have a medical application and your customers ask their medical questions in that app, and all of a sudden the refusals come in from the model side and say like we can't answer those questions, right? This is not per se a model capability issue. This is really a specific provider based policy issue. And so that is something to be aware of as well. So when you think about it within your product, I made a list, and I think you should do too, of all the jobs or tasks that you do for your customers and order them by sensitivity. This can include internal work as well, obviously, right? Like order them by sensitivity and let's say privacy demands as well as like the level of compute potentially needed for it. So do you need the smartest model for this one? And then just see what work you can offload to, let's say, open source models with a zero retention policy. So things like data classification, extraction of certain data, or formatting documents. These are good examples of things that open models can do really, really well, and they do not require Mythos level intelligence. And the only way is to try, obviously. One is in an unstructured way, just try manually to see how these open models do for you for which task. And the separation that not all jobs are done with the same model is, I think, something that will become increasingly important. And the second one is that you have evaluations and rubrics in place to make a systematized evaluation of whether or not an open model would be good enough here. Right, so to wrap us up here, basically, it's don't panic. It is don't avoid using US models all of a sudden. They're still building by far the best AI intelligence that we can currently see. And I think it is important to stay on the cutting edge in order to understand like what will be the applications and the most useful use of this compute that we now have access to. But every serious AI operator and product builder should now check their access risk. So can I call the model tomorrow? Substitution risk. What would I actually replace this with? And the data and control risk, like which data policies and retention policies do these different providers and model offer me? And practically what you can do is you can check AI gateways that are provider agnostic, and then keep always 2 models per use case tested and evaluated, meaning that if you have a hard thinking model in your product, you should not just have one, you should have a second one evaluated that you can fall back to from another provider, obviously. Also, start thinking about are there workflows where data privacy, sensitivity, etc. are incredibly important, and how we could evaluate whether or not open models with zero data retention would be a good option. And otherwise, making just the dependency visible within the organization, right? So you get to a path where you can have testable alternatives ready to go. The model is a component of the offering or the workflow that you're delivering. And it is important that you have the right tools and the right fallbacks in place to not be dependent on a single provider. I'll link Armin's article below and all the resources that I used in order to make ourselves less dependent on a single provider. And with that, happy AI building, and see you in the next one.